Welcome to Two Truths, where we explore controversial topics in religion, philosophy, and history from at least two different perspectives. I'm Dr. Darren Yamarino, and today we're going to be looking at raising the dead, Jesus versus Egyptian techniques. A lot to cover, so I'm just going to dive straight in. There really are about 3 accounts of Jesus raising the dead. Now, even that could be debated, as we'll see, as to whether or not everyone's actually dead. But let's look at the first one. So we're going to start with the Gospel of Luke, chapter 7, verse 11. Soon afterwards, Jesus went to a town named Nain, accompanied by his disciples and a large crowd. And when he arrived at the gate of the town, a funeral procession was coming out. A young man had died, the only son of his mother, and she was a widow. And a large crowd from the town was with her. And when the Lord saw her, his heart was filled with pity for her. And he said to her, "Do not weep." Then he walked over and touched the coffin, while the pallbearers stood still. Jesus said to the dead man, "Young man, I say to thee, arise." And he who was dead sat up and began to talk, and Jesus gave him back to his mother. So, pretty simple, straightforward, seemingly account. There's not too much in the way of details. If we want to analyze the technique here, the only thing that we can really sort of gather, and we'll see this as a pattern, Jesus is emotionally moved or heightened, right? He has like a high degree of empathy or compassion for the people that are grieving. So in this case, he's just going to use a very simple command to the deceased to just basically arise, right? Get up. And that's it. That's all it takes. Another thing that's a bit different about this one, though, is that he's actually touching the coffin. He doesn't touch the deceased boy, which is interesting, right? So like he doesn't even need to make that like direct contact to transfer, the power or energy. It's also kind of interesting that since he touches the coffin, there are other people holding it. So there's no sort of account that we have of their experience to whether or not they felt some sort of, right, like transference of power or anything like that. But that's all we've really got in this first one. So we get more in our next account, which is definitely a more well-known and famous account that's in Mark, Matthew, and Luke have this version. So the Synoptic Gospels, as they're known as, have Jairus' daughter. Okay. Now, a little setup, because it's a bit unclear. The versions are different between Mark, Matthew, and Luke. So Mark and Luke say that she is dying, that she's not dead yet. Matthew says that she's dead from the beginning. So there's a slight difference in story here. And then the whole thing, it's bizarre. The story is like there's an interjection into the story where Jesus is like with Jairus and they're going to go see what's going on with his daughter, right? Whether she's dead or not. But then there's this whole story that comes in about a woman who's been very ill for 12 years and she's desperate to be healed. And she believes that if she could just touch Jesus's cloak, that she will be healed. Now, this is kind of interesting and important. So I'm going to take a moment on this. Going back to the Old Testament, right, in the Hebrew Bible, Deuteronomy 22:12, I believe, it states that you are to make for yourself twisted cords on the 4 corners of the garment you wrap around yourself, right, like a prayer shawl. And the idea is that the edge or the hem, I guess you could say, of a garment contains spiritual authority. And we have another good example of this in the Hebrew Bible in 1 Samuel 24, 4-7, where it states that David crept up unnoticed and cut off a corner of Saul's robe. Afterward, David was conscience stricken for having cut off a corner of his robe. He said to his men, "The Lord forbid that I should do such a thing to my master, the Lord's anointed, or lay my hand on him, for he is the anointed of the Lord." So we have kind of showing like David's righteous and all this. Like he comes clean after this in the story to Saul and all of that. And it basically proves that he's eventually going to be like, worthy to be king. But it's interesting because it's kind of like this transfer again of power, situation, or authority. And it comes down to the edge of Saul's robe, right? So there's this idea that somehow a prayer shawl or something like that, or the clothes that are worn by holy people can transfer authority, basically. Now, the woman's healed in the story because of like her faith. And then we fast forward a little bit and we're back into this story about Jairus' daughter and trying to see if she's dead or not. And that's where we're at now. I'm going to read from the Gospel of Mark's version because the Gospel of Mark is the oldest. And so I don't know, maybe in that sense, it might have a little more authority. Here we go. While Jesus was still speaking, some people came from the house of Jairus, the synagogue leader. "Your daughter is dead," they said. "Why bother the teacher anymore?" Overhearing what they said, Jesus told him, "Do not be afraid, just believe." He did not let anyone follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. When they came to the home of the synagogue leader, Jesus saw a commotion, with people crying and wailing loudly. He went in and said to them, "Why all this commotion and wailing? The child is not dead, but asleep." But they laughed at him. After he put them all out, he took the child's father and mother and the disciples who were with him and went in where the child was. He took her by the hand and said to her, "Talitha cum," which means, "Little girl, I say to you, get up," or arise. Immediately the girl stood up and began to walk around. She was 12 years old. At this they were completely astonished. He gave strict orders not to let anyone know about this and told them to give her something to eat. So there we have the story, right? Now, here's some sort of key plot points and add-ons to our prior account. I think the first thing that's interesting to note here is that Jesus even says that she is not dead. Now, how are we to take this? Is that literal, that somehow he knows she's actually not dead and this isn't an example of raising someone from the dead? Like maybe she's in a coma, something like that. Or she's like so ill or whatever that the breathing's so shallow or something like that, right? That it just appears that way. So that's one way you could maybe look at this. It's certainly not the standard way. The standard answer, of course, is that she's dead, but he's basically saying, well, she's sleeping because he knows he's going to be able to raise her from the dead. Again, like the first story, there is a group and they have a very high emotional intensity, right? The father and the mother are there and they believe that their child is dead, right? And Jesus has been moved as well. And so there's this really high emotional intensity, which might be important in order to achieve these results. In this case, he says Talitha cum, which sounds like a magical maybe phrase, but it's not. If you are familiar with more of the magical text, like the Greco-Egyptian magical papyri, which we'll look at in a minute, it's very short. Talitha cum's not some long-winded statement. If you look at a lot of the stuff in the magical text of the time, not always, but more often than not, there's lines of a bunch of like what are known as kind of like barbarous words, these sort of strange phrases that have a lot of vowels in them. And you don't really have that here, right? So it's a short statement and it's very direct. Again, like the first one was, where he's basically telling her, get up. So it doesn't seem like Jesus really cares about, any of the weird magical aspects of stuff. Unlike the first time, he does touch the girl this time. So there's a direct, contact, which is a bit different. Another thing is, might not be that important, but he says at the end of the story that she should eat. So it kind of makes us wonder, again, was she dead already, or was she somehow maybe being poorly tended to with like a, poor medical practice and theory? I don't know. Maybe they were fasting, right? For her for a long time. And so she appeared to be dead. We'll never know. Regardless, that's a pretty famous account that's in 3 of the Gospels, which makes it, important to take note. The other versions, we got it just in Luke and then only in the Gospel of John. So let's turn to that last one now, which is certainly the most famous of all, the raising of Lazarus. And this is coming from the Gospel of John, chapter 11. It's a long account, and I'm not going to read all of it. I'm going to jump in kind of like right at the beginning of sort of the action of the emotional intensity. So Gospel of John, chapter 11, verse 35, which happens to be the shortest verse in the whole New Testament. Jesus wept, right? Powerful. Especially if we were to understand this as like God incarnate, then it's, very moving. This idea that God is love, and you have this like overwhelming experience of weeping, not even just like, a little bit of tears or something. So that's the opening verse, but continuing on here. Then the Jews said, "See how he loved him?" But some of them said, "Could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this man from dying?" Jesus, once more deeply moved, came to the tomb. It was a cave with a stone laid across the entrance. "Take away the stone," he said. "But Lord," said Martha, the sister of the dead man, "by this time there is a bad odor, for he has been there 4 days." Then Jesus said, "Did I not tell you that if you believe, you will see the glory of God?" So they took away the stone. Then Jesus looked up and said, "Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I knew that you always hear me. But I said this for the benefit of the people standing here, that they may believe that you sent me." When he had said this, Jesus called in a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out." The dead man came out, his hands and feet wrapped with strips of linen, and a cloth around his face. Jesus said to them, "Take off the grave clothes and let him go." So there we have it. This one is very important because it says specifically that he's been dead for 4 days at least. So we're to believe on this example for sure that he is dead. That it smells in the tomb, right? He's basically decaying in the tomb. So just in case there was doubt on the other examples, right? Another thing that's kind of intriguing about this one that's a bit maybe unfortunate that we don't have more detail. It's a tiny little piece at the very end here. It says that he has a cloth around his face. So Jesus also has this at his own burial, the sudarium, this face cloth, that it's bound. I mean, it doesn't say it in the version I read, but in the Greek, it pretty much implies that it's also, bound to his body. I say it's unfortunate because is there an image, when we think of the Shroud of Turin, which I can bring that up, right? The Shroud of Turin and the Sudari, these two famous relics, and you think about like stains and especially with the Shroud of Turin, like the image, right? The image of Christ that is imprinted through radiation. If you believe, you're a believer in that way, that the moment of the resurrection sort of imprinted this image on the cloth. I just say it's unfortunate because if Jesus raises Lazarus, right, from the dead, it's a shame that they didn't make any mention about the face cloth, about any sort of like image or something on it. That would have been a nice little detail to have. But anyhow, we go with what we have. Jesus himself is weeping. This is like his personal friend. So this is not someone like the other two examples where he doesn't really seem to know these people. This is someone he knows well, and he knows the sisters. He's tied in to this family, and that's something that brings a super high level, right, of emotional intensity. Hence the weeping on his part. And we know he's been dead for 4 days and possibly, smelling. So the other thing that's different here is Jesus seems to tap into the power of God the Father, which is different from the other stories. He didn't say anything about, Father, give me the power or something like this to raise Lazarus. But in this account, he does. He looks up, right, up to the heavens and essentially calls upon God the Father to sort of like channel the power. But similar to the other stories, he does just say, Lazarus, come out. Pretty similar to like arise or get up or whatever, right? It's very straightforward for Jesus. That's the takeaway before we move on to Egypt now. Jesus, it's just like short, instant, almost seems as easy as anything else you would try and do. Now, the idea is, of course, because the Gospels are trying to portray him as this is God on earth, right? The incarnation. So this is not magic that's happening. They're like very, I think, consciously aware of crafting the narrative that way. As we'll see, it's quite distinct in the sort of magic world in terms of the way this would happen, trying to raise the dead. And why? That's going to be the big thing now as we move to Egypt. But like, why is he raising these people? For no other reason than to basically be compassionate, essentially, right? Because he's moved by the family's suffering. That is totally different from what we're going to move into. You normally raise the dead for selfish reasons. In magic, it's that simple. You raise the dead because you want something from them. Mainly, you want to either make them an assistant, to serve you in some manner, and you want information. So you're doing it for like divination. It's necromancy, right? A divination with the dead. And this is completely illegal. So in Leviticus chapter 20, verse 27, it flat out says that it's the death penalty by stoning for anyone who's engaged in necromancy. And now Jesus seems to be maybe not engaged in necromancy, but something that is close enough. And to prove that point, right after raising Lazarus, the whole thing starts to unravel. Like that's when the council's called and they basically want to arrest Jesus because they're like, this is too much now. He's like working way too many signs, stuff like that. So anyhow, that's that. Let's transition now into Egypt, okay? Now, I have two quick examples from Egypt at the time of Jesus, first century approximately. I mean, I don't have the exact date on them. They're from the Greco-magical papyri. So very close to the same time as like what Jesus would have learned and, might know about, especially if he was in Egypt, which some people claim, certain rabbis claim that. It does even mention the Bible as a child and that he might have gone there, but the claim is that he went there as like an adolescent or adult. We don't know. But if he did, he might have encountered stuff like this. Here is a spell to question a corpse. Okay. So it goes like this. On a flax leaf, write these things. Azel Balamako, which is 12 sort of Greek letters. So the ink it says to use should be made from red ochre, burnt myrrh, juice of fresh wormwood, evergreen and flax, and write on the leaf and put it in the mouth of the corpse. So what we get here is that basically you're writing some sort of like barbarous word or phrase, like a phrase of power, and you have to physically make something and then physically put that inside the mouth of the deceased in order for them to talk to you or give you some sort of divination. That's already very different, right, than what we saw Jesus doing. Here we have another example, this time using something that's coming from more of Greek literature and text from Homer's works. So this is also from the Greco-Egyptian magical papyri. This is for divine assistance from 3 Homeric verses. So these are, to start out, these are the 3 like quotes, Homeric quotes. After saying this, he drove the solid-hoofed horses through the ditch. Second one. And men grasping out their lives amid the terrible slaughter. And the third quote. And they washed off in the sea the sweat that covered them. So those are our 3 quotes. Now, what you're supposed to do with it, it says, is to attach it to an iron, basically lamella, like it's a piece of metal that you could punch in, and press the phrase onto. Okay. And with an iron though, it says to do this, which is weird because iron's not typically what you're using. It's lead or silver or gold or something like that. So this is a bit weird, but it is what it is. So it says that you should attach it with the verses written on it to a criminal who has been executed. Speak the verses in his ear, and he will tell you everything you wish. So pretty weird. Then it goes on to say that you can insert this piece of metal with the text on it into the criminal's wound. I mean, presuming he has one, I guess, right? Into his wound, and you will have a great blessing. So these are the sort of strange, things that you get in the Greco-magical papyri. They're not a great example of raising the dead, maybe permanently. It seems like it might be some sort of temporary thing for you to engage in necromancy or divination in some way. Now, let's get to the most interesting. We're going to go back though in time. So this isn't really exactly contemporary with Jesus, but I think it's interesting to do a little compare contrast with the ancient Egyptian rite of the opening of the mouth. This is the cornerstone really for reanimation. You must have this. And it is long, let me tell you. It's long, it's involved, it requires lots of different priests, a whole bunch of ritual items. There's no way that we're going to be able to go into all of that. So just to give you a little bit, you could do this directly onto the mummy, right? Or you could do this onto the body, or you could do this onto a statue that's going to be a repository for the spirit of the deceased. That becomes more common, certainly more common as we're closer to Jesus's time. Now, if you're using like the statue method, you're going to place it on a mound of sand. That's the first step. Okay. Why? It's weird. Why would you put a statue on sand? Presumably because it's kind of like a pyramid in a way. And a pyramid is in the mythology of the first birth, first creation of the gods. So this whole thing's going to be like symbolic of an actual live birth in some ways, and also the mythology. So that's probably why they do that. You're going to have the statue. I'm just giving you some elements of what happens in the ritual here, because it's got like 30 different ceremonies. Water is going to be poured over it repeatedly to purify it. Incense is going to be burned at multiple different points in front of it. Tons of different like incantations that are very repetitive are going to be stated in front of the statue. So those are sort of the main things that are going to happen. Then you're going to need to have a bunch of ritual items, paraphernalia, okay, that are going to be used to actually like touch to the mouth and to the eyes of the statue or the deceased to open them. So you need all that stuff. You need to have the different priests. The priests have to have special clothing, as we'll see. And there's going to be multiple sacrifices of animals at various points in this, mainly of a bull, which is large and expensive. And you're going to take the heart of the bull out and bring that up to the statue. Okay? All these things happen. None of that sounds even remotely similar to what Jesus is doing. The similarity here is that they do believe that you are actually like reanimating someone here. It's not just for the purpose of some quick divination. So that's why it's worth looking at any possible parallels. The only one I want to focus on, though, if there's 30 ceremonies making this up, for example, in like Seti the First, we have great examples of his, the opening of the mouth, including these vignettes. There's like these images, right, that correspond to it, which are very helpful. So that's sort of where it's from his version, basically, that a lot of this is coming from. Now, I'm only going to read to you the 9th of these 30 ceremonies, because this one has some intriguing parallels to what's going on in the accounts with Jesus. So here we go. I'll read through this and then do a quick analysis. Sort of jumping in the middle here of this 9th ceremony. On this bed, we're in a tomb for the deceased, okay? Like on this bed was the Sim priest. The Sim priest is the kind of like high priest responsible for funerary and mortuary rites. Very important person, okay? On this bed was the Sim priest, who was arrayed in a long, close-fitting garment. This was probably the skin of a bull, okay, that he's wearing. His legs were drawn up. His hands were clasped together on his breast. His elbows projected from his sides, and he was supposed to be asleep. Right? Standing behind or near the sleeping Sim priest was another priestly official or ministrant, the Amas, or Amias, who also performed duties in connection with the interior of the tomb. As the Kerheb, these are all priests, okay, the Kerheb and Amkint were about to enter the tomb, the Amas said, "O my father, my father, O my father, my father, O my father, my father, O my father, my father." 4 repetitions. At these words, the Sim priest, who had been lying down, sat up quickly, and as he did so, he saw the Kerheb and the Amkint at the door of the tomb. He then said, "I was lying down, right? And one roused me. Right? I was asleep, and one touched me. I have seen my father in his every form." In answer to these words, the Kerhab and his 2 companions said, according to the text that we studied the first, right, which we're going with, they said this to the Sim priest, "Is not thy father with thee?" And then jumping in the account a little bit, there's this other line that might be relevant. And the Kerhab replied to the Sim priest, "There is his shadow, but there is no impurity therein." So there we've got it. A account straight from a very old text, right? The Egyptian text from Seti the First, the opening of the mouth ritual. Now, what can we really gather there that's of interest? You have this like reenactment of a priest, a Sim priest, very important, who's literally wrapped up, much like Lazarus in many ways. Now, maybe he's in a bull skin. It's not 100% clear that's even the case. If he is in like a bull skin, it's kind of because you're being like born through the sacrificial victim that is the bull that's also associated with Osiris. So it's all part of like imparting the energy or power of the gods who are associated with certain animals symbolically. So that could be why he might be wearing that. But he's wrapped up, and he looks like a deceased person. And then you have someone coming into the tomb, just like with Jesus going into the cave, right? And there's this whole issue of the saying of, "Oh, my father" piece, which is somewhat reminiscent. Might be in a different context here, though, but still the wording is interesting. And then the simple thing of he sits up really quickly and basically he's like, "Someone has roused me." The whole kind of pattern is kind of similar to the accounts that we have of Jesus. And then we have this interesting last piece where it talks about his shadow. That's not actually in the version of Seti the First, but in many of the other versions of the opening the mouth ritual, they have it for this part of the ceremony where they talk about the shadow soul, which is a part of who you are, like what makes up a living person. You've got a Ka, a Ba, and other elements too, but a shadow soul. And that this particular ceremony is probably to make sure, like to bring back the shadow soul as you're in this whole long process of like reanimating someone. So interesting. Not saying there's a strong connection to Jesus in any way there. Certainly Jesus's methods are a heck of a lot easier and seem to be more effective. I mean, this takes a ton of time and money to go through the elaborate layers of ritual. I mean, it's pretty crazy. It culminates, by the way, for the opening of the mouth. You have to touch the eyes too. You touch the mouth and with these tools. You touch like a bunch of stuff like the heart, a leg of an ox, and all this stuff like to the statue or to the deceased. And then eventually you're going to anoint it, which is also an interesting kind of thing, right? With the anointing. And then you're going to, like with oil, and then you're going to put clothes on it towards the end. Kind of like makeup, clothes, the whole deal. You're basically like it's almost like bringing a person back to life from the beginning as a baby, all through the process to somehow like a reanimated adult. Right? So a lot that's going on there. But let me know what you think about the stuff. If you have any other good examples, I'd love to hear from the ancient world of reanimation, because there are a lot of other ones. In fact, probably the earliest account, other than the Egyptian one I just gave you, is actually from Homer, where Odysseus is having to go into this involved situation in the underworld, if I recall, with Circe giving him spells to say or something like that. I don't have a perfect memory of it, but that's an old account. So it's all throughout the Mediterranean and ancient Near East. Certainly in Persia, huge amount of necromancy and stuff going on. So Anyhow, let me know what you think about this and any of the specific elements. I'd love to hear it. All right? Is it possible to raise someone from the dead? Maybe. Doesn't seem that easy by even today's standards with technology. But since we have all these accounts, maybe it would be best for us to, hold off on some of our biases and stay gray.